10. The sound of the cell closing was surprisingly soft. It wasn't due to the fact that the dark elf soldiers who took us to the cell were particularly gentlemanly. It was because the entire structure, as sturdy as it looked, was built out of wood. When the captain and his 4 soldiers left for the hallway and marched out of earshot, I took a look around the prison cell. It was a small space, with 2 simple beds and 1 table. There was a pitcher of water and cups on the table. Instead of a lantern, a bonfire shroom glowed from a fixture on the wall. I went over to the table, picked up the pitcher to examine it. The body was made of glass, but the handle was wood. The cups, meanwhile, were entirely wooden. The table and beds were constructed of complex tongue and groove joints, without a single visible nail. It seemed that the prison, and likely the entire palace, was made without any metal at all. The only exception were the weapons and armor the dark elves used. Out of sheer habit, I lifted my hand to my left side, but there was no sword to touch. The sword of Eventide, Asuna's chivalric rapier, and both our sigil of Lysula had been confiscated when they took us here and put us in a small storage room of some kind. I stifled a sigh, grabbed a cup, poured some water, sniffing just in case before I drank it. No poison or paralysis debuff icons appeared, so I poured more water into the other cup and handed it to Asuna, who stood still in the center of the cell. Come on, drink up. It's just water. Okay, she said, taking the cup with both hands and drinking it rather slowly. It wasn't very cold water, but it had the effect of calming her down a little. Some light returned to her empty eyes. She blinked twice, then once more, and looked at me. I wonder if Kismel is being held in the cells here too. It was the question of the moment. I considered it briefly before replying. If so, it's not anywhere near us. If she were close by, she'd have called for us already. Let's see. I wonder if it'll show up on the map. I opened up my window and switched to the map tab. Fortunately, it displayed a map of Harin Tree Palace, so we examined it together. Most of it was still grayed out, but we could at least take a guess as to the structure of the prison. This cell we're in now is on the west side of the second basement level. The stairs and the guard stations are in the center. That tells me there's probably a cell in the east side too. And Kismel's there? It's possible, I said. Asuna bit her lip. Eventually, through a voice hoarse with concealed pain, she said, You remember what Kismel said? When we asked her about having to take responsibility for losing the sacred keys on the 6th floor. Yeah. She said, I am one of the Queen's own royal pagoda knights. Only Her Majesty and the Knights Commander have the right to formally rebuke me. Rebuke me. And, like she said, I don't think Kismel was punished in Castle Galley. If that were going to happen, she would have been put in a cell there. So why did they lock her up here on the 7th floor? Asuna's question was a good one. I stared up at the wood-paneled ceiling and mulled aloud. If you interpret things as strict as possible, that would mean that someone here in Harin Palace has the authority to imprison Kismel, either the commander of the Pagoda Knights or the Dark Elf Queen herself. But I don't think that's actually possible. Those two don't leave their castle on the 9th floor, which means there's someone else here at this base that Kismel doesn't know. Someone with the same power as her commander. Who would that be, for example? A different Knights Brigade, like, when I got lost, Asuna was there to fill in the blanks in my memory. The Sandalwood Knights and the Trifoliate Knights. Right, one of their commanders. But if the Pagoda Knights commander doesn't leave the castle, wouldn't the same be true for the others? Good point. I had to admit, I hesitated, then added, I'm gonna spoil you a bit here, but when you get to the castle on the 9th floor, you end up taking some pretty long fetch quests for each of the 3 knight commanders. If any of them aren't present in the castle anymore, you wouldn't be able to take their quest or turn it in. I see. Asuna's brows creased. She looked down, thinking hard, then her head shot up. Oh, that's it! That's what we need to check, the quest log. Oh. I stared into her hazel brown eyes, then quickly ran my finger along the open player window, switching from the map tab to the quest tab, then opening the Elf War campaign quest tree. There was Jade Key, the Lapis Key, the Amber Key, the Agate Key, and then at the bottom, a new title, the Ruby Key. I tapped the words to expand the tree further, bringing up the title of the first latest strings of quest. Presumably, it was Prisoner of the Tree Palace. Asuna and I put our heads together to read the tiny font on the quest log. You have been suspected of working with the fallen elves and imprisoned in the cells of the Harin Tree Palace. To clear your charges, you must find a way to rejoin Kismal. Start by escaping your cell and recovering your confiscated weapons. We were silent for 3 seconds. Then we opened our mouths at the same time. I made you first gesture, so Asuna said quietly, Does this mean that the fallen elves stealing the 4 keys was all part of the story? Or is this like what happened with Silen? And someone or something has happened that's outside of the expected bounds of the storyline, so the quest has been altered to reflect that. I finished for her. When the axe warrior Morche killed Silen, the Lord of Statchen on the 6th floor, I assumed it meant the Curse of Statchen quest was unfinishable, but the story absorbed the fact that another player has killed Silen and guided us down a new path. The same thing was probably happening again here. If so, we should probably assume that the guards spot us escaping, they're not going to put us back in here. That's true. It might even lead to them executing us. What should we do? Stay here and wait? No, Asuna said at once. She stared at me with a firm intent in her eyes. The keys were stolen because Kismal was trying to save us. If she's being tried for a crime because of that, we need to clear her charges and restore her honor at once. Agreed, I said, closing my window. So that means our first step is escape. Those bars are wood, from what I can tell, and I could probably break them with a sword skill from my sub-weapon, but it'll make a ton of noise. It would be one thing if we just had to run outside to freedom, but we need to get our weapons back and find Kismal too. Asuna grumbled. She walked up to the bars that separated the cell from the hallway. I stood next to her, looking thoroughly. The wooden bars, with eyes and wood grain and all, were not rounded but rectangular. It was much like the prison bars in the classic Japanese samurai movies. Each side was about an inch across, and they placed at intervals of about 6 inches, vertically and horizontally. Even the rat couldn't get through these bars. That idea brought me back to our other duty. We were supposed to be gathering 20 ripe Narsos fruit and delivering them to Ninir's room in Volupta by noon, or 1 o'clock at the latest. The time was 5:40 a.m. There was still lots of time, but at this point, Asuna's idea to leave 3 hours early was a brilliant one. In order to make use of this good fortune, We needed to meet up with Kismel as quickly as possible and escape Harin Tree Palace. I gripped one of the shining wooden bars and squeezed hard. I believed that my strength stat was among the higher levels in the frontline group, but this bar wasn't even creaking, much less breaking in half. Next, I pulled a knife out of my inventory to see if I could cut the wood. But it was as though the bars had been finished with some kind of oil. The blade just slipped off the surface and couldn't find purchase. I was thinking that it might be impossible to break the bars without making noise when Asuna came over to me examining the lock part of the door. I don't think we can get out with the lock-picking skill. That figures. But we don't have time to put that into one of our slots and level it up from nothing. I'm thinking the wood material is the key to this. You don't have a saw, do you? I do not. If I had known it was going to come to this, I would have made off with one of those old shipbuilder's saws from the 4th floor. Or bought it like a normal person, Asuna said, side-eyeing me. She traced the cornered wood with her finger. I suppose we could get a rat to chew through it? She was referring to a real rat, not Argo, of course, but the cell was clean. I didn't see any holes in the baseboard where a family of rodents might be living. Or maybe dump water on it to soften it up? We did have plenty of water, but it would probably take an entire month to rot away the wood enough to break it apart. I scolded myself from only cutting down Asuna's ideas and not coming up with any of my own. But no matter how hard I thought, I wasn't reaching any brilliant conclusions. I was starting to think of desperate gambles, like setting fire to the cage or using a sword skill in the chaos that ensued, when an idea arrived fully formed. Fire, I muttered. Asuna looked at me in surprise. Fire? You're going to start a fire in here? No, not to burn the bars, to char them. If we cook them from a proper distance, it should drastically reduce their structural strength. But it can't just be one spot. If we want to make a hole large enough for us to crawl through, we need to burn at least 10 different spots on the bars. Nope, just one. I pressed Asuna to move out of the way, then stood in front of the door. It was also made of the same series of bars, except for the lock, which was enclosed inside a sturdy-looking box, and the mechanisms inside were definitely made out of wood too. If we toasted it for long enough from the outside, it should carbonize the insides. Asuna's face lit up with surprise, and I opened my inventory to remove a torch. I was just about to light it when I realized something very important. Oh. What's wrong? Damn it. If we light it in here, all the bonfire shrooms in the prison are going to go out in a chain reaction. If the shrooms in the guard stations go out, they'll know we're using fire. I was so disappointed that I nearly threw the torch on the ground, but Asuna gripped my arm. It's too early to give up. All we have to do is put out the fire before the chain reaction gets to the guard station, right? Well, technically, I'll watch the shrooms in the hallway from here. When I give the signal, put out the fire immediately. It was a real tightrope act, but it didn't feel like we'd come up with a better plan or have time to try. Fine, I pressed my face up to the bars and looked down the hallway. There were bonfire shroom candlesticks on the walls between the cells, a line of green light that extended to the center of the second basement level where the guard station would be. Let's say the one closest to us is number 1. Tell me when 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them go out. Got it. I'll tap your shoulder, said my partner. With the plan set, I crouched in front of the lock. Taking up one square of the bar pattern, meaning a space 6 inches to a side, was a box containing a lock intricate enough that even dexterous Asuna would give up trying to solve it. But to be that delicate, it had to have a low durability. I checked one more time to see that no one was patrolling the hallway, then tapped the torch and hit the ignite button. A second after the orange flames appeared, the bonfire shroom lighting up the cell went out. Next, the mushrooms lining the hallway would go out, keeping my panic in check. I lowered the flames towards the lock. The dark brown wood did not change in any way at first, but eventually its surface got a little darker and a tendril of smoke rose from it. I felt a smack on my shoulder, and I quickly pressed the extinguish button on the pop-up window, which I'd left open for this purpose. The torch instantly went out, plunging the cell into darkness. I waited, holding my breath, until the bonfire shroom on the wall behind us began to glow again. Every few seconds, one of the lights in the darkened hallway came back on. Did the timing seem like it worked? After a moment, Asuna replied, "Yes, I don't hear anyone coming from the station. I just realized, though, if there were any prisoners in the other cell around us, they would have made some noise." "True. Well, I guess that means it worked. Let's try it again. Keep watch." "On it." Asuna took her position again. I lit the torch. Each round of this gave me about 10 seconds of time. Considering the possibility that soldiers might be patrolling the hallways in addition to waiting in the station, we couldn't take too long at this. I had to judge the exact effectiveness distance that wouldn't light the lock on fire but would still carbonize it as quickly as possible. The second heating burned the center of the wooden plate black. The third burned it red and heated. The fourth caused cracks to spiral outward. In the real world, it probably would take significantly more powerful flame, a longer amount of time to have the same effect. But dried wood and ironclad was especially susceptible to fire. On the fifth attempt, I nearly set it on fire and quickly batted it out with my bare hand. It felt hot, and it took a tiny bit of HP, but that didn't matter. Asuna focused on her watch and was considerate enough not to say anything. On the sixth attempt, the center of the wood plate turned ash and crumbled, revealing the gears and deadbolts inside. As I suspected, they were all made of wood. The craftsmanship was extremely fine. It was a work of art. With a silent apology to the Dark Elf Master who created it, I brought the flames close to a seventh time. A number of gears carbonized before my eyes and crumbled away, followed by some faint sounds from the deadbolt attached to the doorframe. As it came loose from the contraption, I put the torch out and got to my feet. "It's open! GJ!" Asuna said, in a rare instance of gamer lingo, and we did a quick fist bump. I pushed the door gently, and it briefly pushed back, but then came loose as flecks of charred woods were scraped free. Once we were sure that no one was in the corridor either direction, we snuck out of the cell. "First things first, we need to get our weapons," I murmured. Asuna looked worried. "The room where they took our swords was next to the guard station. Can we even get inside without them noticing?" "It'll be devastating if the room is locked. Still, we just have to figure it out." "True." We stopped talking and snuck along the hallway, checking at each of the cells on either side to ensure they were empty before proceeding. After we moved about 60 feet forward, a rectangular hall came into view ahead. That was the center of the basement level. There was supposed to be an ascending staircase on the south side of it, with a guard station and storeroom side by side on the north end. We kept moving, even more carefully this time, until we could look around the corner of the hallway towards the station. Just as I remembered, there were two doors, side by side on the wall. Near the left door was a barred window. Bonfire shrooms, light much brighter than in the cell, shone through it, accompanied by voices. I made eye contact with Asuna, then crossed the hall in a crouch until I was pressed against the wall just under the window. The volume of the voices increases so that I could make out what they were saying. Has it been a new prisoner in those cells in 30 years? And humankind, no less. They were fools for helping the fallen. I presume they were offered longer life, like usual. Humans always fall for that one. Asuna's nostrils flared with indignation. I felt the same way, but it was imperative that we stay calm and careful right then. Based on the voices, there were 2 guards in the station now. There were occasional sounds of tableware clatter, so they were probably eating breakfast. They didn't seem likely to leave the room for a while. We left the window and headed over to the door of the adjacent storage room, praying that it wasn't locked. I examined the door, no lock at all. I quickly held the handle down, then pushed it very slowly as to not make a noise, and slipped inside through the crack. As soon as Asuna was inside, I closed the door and we shared a sigh of relief. The dividing wall seemed thin because we could still faintly hear the guards talking. We couldn't hold the normal conversation in here. I gestured and said, "Let's look for some weapons," then stood up around the storeroom. It was about the size of the cell with 3 walls taken up by shelves and stands for swords and armor. There were tons of wooden boxes and leather gloves and such stacked on shelves. There were swords of all sizes stuck into the holders. If not for the situation, I would be jumping at joy, thinking about the mountain of treasure. But the priority now was to recover our swords. Hopefully the rings too. I started by examining one of the sword stands, which was built much the same way as an umbrella holder from the real world. All of the swords jammed into it were on the verge of falling apart, as though they had been there for decades. If I treated them too roughly, I could easily knock off the hilts and knuckle guards. For a minute or so, I picked through them with my fingertips. Annoyingly, I finally found some sheets with a familiar color and shape, all the way in the back, as though they had been placed there as a prank. Still, this was a relief. Not far away, Asuna waved to say, "Found it!" But she was pointing at a different sword stand, of course. I pulled the sword of Eventide and chivalric rapier free, then looked over to where Asuna was pointing. It was a long sword with details that were slightly different from the usual dark elven make, along with a saber in a black leather sheath. That settled it. The long sword was the elven stout sword we'd taken from the forest elf captain. And the saber was Kismel's weapon, which had been snapped by Kaisara, the fallen elf adjutant. We'd given Kismel the forest elf sword to use after her saber was broken. That all but confirmed that Kismel was somewhere in this prison. I handed Asuna her rapier and mounted my sword on my back, then pulled the stout sword and saber out of the stand together. But something in my haste must have caused my hands to slip. An old-fashioned sword stuck in the same hole as the two wobbled and started to lean towards the adjacent hole. "Ah!" I screamed silently. If the sword smacked against another, which pushed the next one, and so on, like a stack of dominoes, it would make a tremendous clatter. I wanted to grab the sword to stop it, but my hands were full. I'd have to stop it with my mouth or use psychic powers to keep it in place. A hand shot forward and blocked it just in the nick of time. Asuna was leaning over as far as she possibly could, propping up the old sword by her fingertips. "This sword is really heavy," she murmured quietly. In her left hand was the aged sword that had nearly fallen. "Hang on," I whispered, back at the same volume, putting the stout sword and saber into my inventory. With my hands free, I accepted the sword from Asuna. It was indeed quite heavy, much more than my sword of Eventide. There was a large knuckle guard attached to the hilt, and its white leather sheath was slightly curved. This wasn't a long sword, but it was a saber, like Kismel's. The whole thing was dirty, and there was even a spiderweb in the middle of the guard, so it didn't look like a luxury item. Nevertheless, I put it into my inventory too, just in case Kismel found it easier to use. That had been nerve-wracking, but we completed our initial objective and got back our swords. Next up, I wanted the rings, but with the number of boxes and bags in the other room, we'd need way more than just 5 or 10 minutes. Of course, the purpose of the sigil was to allow you free entrance to any Dark Elf base, so the fact that we'd been arrested probably nullified the privilege. I quietly explained as much to Asuna. She looked around at multiple stacked shelves at metal and wooden boxes and the leather and cloth bags. In that case, couldn't we just stick the boxes and bags into our inventories and look through them later? At least some of them, if not all. Her bold idea left me speechless. Time-limited item searches were a common event in RPGs, but taking the containers themselves out of the room had to be outside the boundaries of the scenario, the writer's intentions. In the other hand, all the boxes weren't fixed to the shelf. If there was any worry, it was taking an item that would be identified as theft and turn us into orange players. But if so, I should receive a warning at the point I put the antique saber into my item storage. We were outside the anti-criminal code area of town, so the only punishment we could suffer was for stealing was through Dark Elf law, not the game's systems itself. I reached out to the shelf and carefully lifted the wooden box that was placed on top of the pile of varied containers. There were no anti-theft alarms. The box was not especially heavy. I placed it atop the inventory window, and it vanished with a little flash of blue particles. We shared a silent look, then began shoveling the boxes and bags into our inventory. Because our level was significantly higher than the recommended number for this area, and the fact that we weren't carrying a bunch of heavy weapons around, we had plenty of space. By the time we had both reached 90% of our carrying capacity, the number of containers had dwindled to under a third. The Sigil of Lysula might be in one of those containers we didn't grab, of course, but we didn't want to load up to the maximum, in case our weight limit was crossed at an inopportune time and left us immobilized. When our box thievery was complete, I closed my window and concentrated on my ears. The guards in the station next door were still talking. Even in an underground prison, the Dark Elves' love, tea, and chatter held true. We opened the door again and headed into the open hall. On the opposite wall was the stairway we'd taken down less than an hour ago. On the right was the hallway leading to the cells on the west side. As I expected and hoped, there was a hallway leading to the east on the left. If Kismel was a prisoner here, she would be that way. I glanced at Asuna, then snuck down the eastern hallway. Using the bonfire shroom light, we looked into each cell lining the corridor. The actual amount of light from the mushrooms was meager, but they stayed on, even in the cells with no occupants, so a meager glance showed us the contents of each one as we passed. But because of that, we rapidly ran lower and lower on cells to check. We were already halfway down the corridor and still hadn't seen Kismel yet. There were 8 cells on either side of the 60-foot hallway, 16 in total. 8 cells left to check. 7, 6, 5. Each of them was empty, and it didn't look like they'd been used in years, if not decades. Our feet felt heavier and heavier as we neared the end, but we had to keep checking. 4 more. 3. 2. The instant we looked into the last cell, we both sucked in a sharp breath. It took all of 2 seconds for our hopes to deflate. All of one of the 2 beds was occupied by a figure lying on its side, but the silhouette very obviously did not belong to Kismel. The body was large for an elf and clearly male. I held my gaze on him until a yellow cursor appeared. The name was Dark Elven Prisoner. That didn't tell us who it was, but if he wasn't Kismel, we had no reason to talk to him. We'd just be ruining ourselves if he raised a fuss and brought the guards running. I motioned for Asuna to back away, and I inched backward on my heels. The prisoner's back was towards us, so he wouldn't notice us unless we made a noise. Or so I thought. I hadn't moved more than a foot when the prisoner said quietly, "You're not elves. Who are you?" We froze with shock, and the figure rose and turned to face us. He was wearing a simple outfit of a cotton shirt and pants that had once been black but had faded to gray. His hair and beard had grown out to the point that I couldn't even discern his features. Behind his hanging black bangs, I could see gleaming, intense eyes. We're nobodies. We'll just be leaving," I managed to stammer, resuming my retreat. "If you don't answer me, I'll call the guards," his rusty voice said, nailing me down to the spot. I'm the human swordsman Kirito, and this is Asuna." "What are you doing here?" "We're looking for someone." "Who?" His questions were short and direct, leaving me no time to think about lying to him. I just had to steel myself and tell the truth. "A knight by the name of Kismel. She was brought here within the last day, we believe." "Kismel? From what family?" he asked. To our surprise, I looked to Asuna, but the fencer just shook her head. I turned back to him and said, I don't know." "Then I don't know either," said the prisoner, reaching for his side table and pouring water from the pitcher to his wooden cup. They were the same things we had in our cell. He finished the water in one gulp and set down the cup, then asked, "And you were the ones who were brought in here a little while ago?" Yes." "Then this knight, Kismel, is not being held on this floor. I've been imprisoned here for 30 years, and you are the first prisoners since my arrival." 30 years, I repeated, stunned. A month ago, I would have assumed this was just a background for his story. After all, in 1993, 30 years before 2023, there was no SAO. There wasn't even a single VR MMO with old-fashioned head-mounted displays. But meeting Kismel and learning about the long history of the war between the Forest Elves and the Dark Elves, my way of thinking had begun to change. If not for the human players diving into this server, they could run time in this world as fast as the server specs allowed. So it was possible that before SAO launched, they had compiled the history of the centuries since the Great Separation of Aincrad, if not even further into the past. "Why are you in this cell?" asked Asuna over my shoulder, her voice hoarse. The bearded man's eyes fixed on Asuna. "For no reason that you need to know, human girl." He was lying on his side again, sending the message that our conversation was over. But I persisted. I didn't want to leave without learning something useful. Are the other cells here in Harin Tree Palace?" The man didn't say anything for several seconds until at last I heard him snort. Something struck me as strange, but I couldn't hold on to the thought, because he started speaking into the mushroom-lit gloom. "There is also a prison in the priestess's living quarters on the 7th floor. If the crime this Kismel committed has anything to do with them, she may have been taken there." But Kismel's sword was in the storeroom down there," I blurted out. The man rose up again. "You were into the storeroom?" "Well, yeah." "How did you get out of your cell without the guards noticing?" I used a torch to burn the lock on the door." The man's broad shoulders trembled. A few moments later, I heard him uttering a short and quiet sounds and realized at last that he was laughing. "Please don't start screaming with laughter," I prayed. Fortunately, the chuckles got softer and softer until he was done. He shook his head, then said dryly, "I see. Your human art of mystic scribing. The gods certainly cannot inspect that." Yeah, I replied, mind racing. We could use the same method to break the lock on this man's cell too. Following quest logic, if we freed this man, he would presumably help us. Assuming this story development was written by someone employed by Argus, that would be the proper answer. But more than likely, our trip through the Elf War campaign questline was far off the track of its original scenario. Now that Akihio Kaiba had turned SAO into what it was, the Argus was no longer managing the game. It was impossible to imagine a flesh and blood person carefully modifying the quest for every living player. And if the game system itself was rewriting the quest in real time, I had to assume that the typical expectations were out of the window. This prisoner was a living human being, a dark elf. Could he be trusted or not? That was the real question. A 30-year sentence in this underground prison meant he must have committed quite a crime. So what was it? He just said, "Nothing you need to know about, human." So maybe there's another clue. Do you have any brothers?" Asuna asked out of the blue. I turned to look at her, stunned. The man was surprised too, it seemed. He blinked in silence, then replied, "What made you ask that?" "Because I know a dark elf who looks very similar to you." In my head, I was thinking, what? If Asuna knew him, then I knew him too, presumably. But what dark elf did I know who looked like this prisoner with the scraggly hair and a grown-out beard? And speaking of male dark elves, the only ones I really knew to any extent were Viscount Yershren Zed Yoflis at Yofel Castle, and Bohrum at Castle Galli, and maybe Count Melon Gallion. The only thing any of them shared in common with this man is the color of their skin. I felt another crackle of electricity run through the center of my brain. My eyes shot open. No, there was another dark elf I knew. If you could use that verb. Asuna waited until she was certain I'd figured it out too. He did not tell us his name, but he works as a blacksmith in the camp on the 3rd floor. He strengthened this sword of mine. She walked closer to the cell, squeezing the grip of the chivalric rapier. She pulled it out of the sheath backhanded, then extended the pommel through the bars. I would have taken several seconds to mull this one over before I acted, but there wasn't a single ounce of hesitation in Asuna's expression. The prisoner stared at us through his long bangs, then abruptly stepped out of the bed. He stuck his feet into the sandals that were barely more than scraps of material, then walked up to the bars. He grabbed the hilt of the rapier Asuna was holding towards him and pulled it into the cell. He held it up near his forehead, allowing the light from the bonfire shroom on the wall behind him to illuminate the shining blade, then said, "Yes, I can see that Landarin tempered this sword. He produced nothing but junk before. But after 30 years, I suppose the bungler has learned a few things." Assuming that Landarin was the name of that exceedingly unfriendly blacksmith, I was afraid to even imagine how he would react to being called the bungler. At the very least, I knew he'd do more than snort. And that was when I realized what had been setting off my deja vu earlier. The way he exhaled through his nose was exactly the same how the blacksmith had. The man spun the rapier around, then stuck the hilt back through the bars. Asuna grabbed it, then took a step back. "If you've done a service for my brother, then I should thank you. I will help you search for Kismel the knight." I didn't even have time to marvel over his sudden change in attitude when Asuna pointed out, "That's very kind of you, but he was the one who did a service for us." "An elf blacksmith will only see the chance to work on a sword that fine a number of times in his life. I'm certain that the experience will have helped my little brother grow." "Are you a blacksmith too?" "No," the prisoner said, the bangs that hung to his nose swaying. "I did not have the talent, My brother had the blacksmith's blood in his veins, like my father and my grandfather. But I did not even have that. He stopped there, returning to the bed. I started to worry that he'd change his mind about helping us, but instead of rolling back into the mattress, he grabbed the faded sheet and carefully tore a strip from the corner. Then he used to make a makeshift rope to tie his long hair behind his head. Revealed at last, the man's face had all the sternness of a typical dark elf, despite his overgrown facial hair. By human years, he looked like he was in his late 30s. He was indeed quite similar to the blacksmith on the third floor, but there was one other feature that caused me to gasp. Running across his face, from cheek to cheek, about an inch under his eyes, was a sword scar. It was not a new wound, but it stood out starkly against his dark skin. It must have been quite deep when it was inflicted. Sensing our eyes, the man ran his thumb along the mark and snorted. He strode up to the bars and eyed the direction of the guard station. Asuna and I glanced down the hallway. There was no signs of guards leaving the room yet, but they would probably come patrolling once their meal was over. My intuition told me we had a few minutes at most. "I'm going to burn the lock. Step back, please," I said, but the man shook his head. "Do not bother. Instead, go to the storeroom next to the station and bring back my sword." "Really? You want us to go search through all those swords?" I thought, keeping it to myself. What kind of sword was it? "A saber. Its hilt and guard are silver, while the handle and sheath are white leather. You might not recognize it by those details because it's surely covered in 30 years of dust." Asuna and I stared at each other. I opened my inventory, sorted the weapons by most recent, then tapped the first name on the list, the Saber of Santalum Knights, and materialized it. A large saber appeared with a soft sound. I used both hands to lift it up. The dirtiness effect were supposed to disappear after a short period of time in this world, but the grime fixed to the hilt and the spiderwebs inside the knuckle were as I recognized them earlier. They would probably clean up if I used a cloth, but it seemed like a strange thing to do, so I stuck the handle through the bars. The man hesitated for just an instant, then grabbed the saber and pulled it through to the cell, sheath and all. When he noticed the spiderweb, he snorted, then grabbed his bedsheet again and quickly but carefully rubbed the entire saber with it. It regained its sheen and looked good as new, or at least not as quite as old. He stuck the sheath onto his belt on the left side, then drew the weapon. The finely curved blade gave a dull shine in the light of the bonfire shrooms. That wasn't because of any grime on the weapon, though. It was the quality of a fine weapon, one that had many years of combat and upkeep. My anneal blade +8, which had broken in the battle against the forest elf knight, had the same sheen to it. I thought back to my old, trusty weapon, which still slumbered in the depths of my inventory in its broken state. The man glared at me and warned, "Step back." "Ah, right." Asuna and I backed away from the bars. The man moved to the door, then held the naked saber overhead. I didn't even have time to cry, "Whoa, wait!" and the blade took a silver shine, then rang like a piece of struck glass. It was the warm-up effect of a sword skill. If he knocked down the door with the sheer strength, it would make an incredible racket and bring the guards down on us immediately. After all the trouble we'd gone to silently carbonizing the lock, this was going to ruin everything. A silver light flickered in the darkness. 2 or 3 tiny sparks appeared in the gap between the door and the next bar. That was it. No deafening crash, not even as much as a sound as a cup being placed on a table. The saber was back to its spot over the man's head, which made me wonder if he'd used the sword skill at all. But there was no denying the perfect vertical silver line he created. He returned the saber to its sheath, stepped forward, and pushed the door with his thumb. It made the slightest of creaks and swung open easy as that. The part of the lock bolt left on the door was cut through so cleanly that it looked like it had been polished that way. What was that technique?" I asked without thinking. The man shrugged and said, It's called Slashing Ray, I believe. I never heard of that skill. Most likely it was an elite skill in the curved blade category. I was tempted to ask to see its stats, but I didn't even know how to open an NPC status window. Maybe if you tapped on their hair whorl, it would open up a property window. I certainly didn't have the courage to attempt that with the old man or young man. The man exited the cell into the hallway, then stretched and cracked his neck from side to side. If he'd really been trapped in the cell for 30 years, then he'd have to be experiencing bewildering sense of freedom. But a few mere stretches and cracks had him satisfied, apparently. His steel gray eyes fixed the two of us with a glare. What did you say your names were? I'm Kirito, and I'm Asuna. The man repeated, Kirito and Asuna. His pronunciation was perfect, and of all the NPCs we met, his check was the shortest. We confirmed that he was right, and then said, I am Lavic. That was the indication that he was joining the party. A new HP bar appeared underneath ours in the upper view. It also showed me that the name that had been on his cursor, it had went from Dark Elven Prisoner to Lavic, the Dark Elven Fugitive. The English word fugitive did not have an entry in my mental dictionary, but I could ask Asuna later. First, I asked Lavic which way we were going now. So, how do we get up to the 7th story to find Kismel? She might be on the 7th story, Lavic corrected, brusquely. First, we need to get information from the guards. Huh? Are you going to bribe them? Only if you have enough money to buy a lakeside mansion on the 9th floor. We shook our heads. The bearded dark elf snorted yet again. Then we'll use swords.